You're imprisoned in a cold stone cell, deep beneath the most magnificent arena ever constructed. Above, a crowd of 50,000 Romans has just witnessed your husband being torn apart by a lion. Now, the stadium is emptying, and the torchlight is beginning to fade. Suddenly, you hear the sound of approaching footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and drawing nearer. A hulking shadow eclipses the light from your doorway. It is the gladiator, the one who emerged victorious from today's carnage. He stands there, drenched in blood that does not belong to him. A guard turns a key, unlocking your cell, and the gladiator simply points in your direction. This is not a scene from some terrifying film. This was just another Tuesday in the Roman Empire. What I am about to reveal is the part of Roman history that is deliberately left out of textbooks, a true and shocking dark history. We're peeling back the layers on a systematic, state-sanctioned nightmare that began long after the roaring crowds had departed. This is not mere speculation. It's meticulously documented by Roman authors, and the proof is literally etched into the stone walls beneath the Colosseum itself. If you remain with me until the conclusion, your perception of ancient Rome will be shattered forever. For decades, Hollywood has sold you a romanticized lie about gladiators. Films like Gladiator and Spartacus's showcase the gore and the glory, the honor and the heroic rebellion. But what they conveniently omit is the grim reality of what transpired in the hours after the games concluded, when the public performance morphed into something profoundly more sinister. I'm referring to a system so deeply unsettling that modern historians had to coin a new Latin phrase to even begin to describe it, victoria carnalis, which translates to the carnal victory. The Romans, however, never used this term, because for them, this practice wasn't remarkable enough to warrant a special name. It was simply a part of their daily life. Here is what we know with absolute certainty. Roman chroniclers such as Martial, Juvenal, and Seneca recorded a world where women taken in conquest were stockpiled in the chambers beneath the arenas and given out as rewards. And I don't mean that as a figure of speech. They were literally distributed like provisions to the gladiators who had distinguished themselves in combat. The Roman state itself managed this entire operation with the same cold, bureaucratic precision they applied to constructing their famous aqueducts and roadways. Just pause and consider that. The very civilization that gave us innovations like concrete and representative democracy also perfected the industrial-scale mechanization of sexual exploitation. Now, before we delve any deeper, I need you to do one thing. Take a look at the like button on your screen. If you agree that this kind of hidden, uncomfortable, dark history must be brought into the light, please press that button. And leave a comment letting me know where on this planet you are watching from. Because this story isn't confined to Rome, it's about the shadows that empires cast when they believe no one is paying attention. Now, let us make our descent into the hypogeum. To truly grasp what occurred in those subterranean passages, you must first understand Rome's methodology for converting human beings into mere items of inventory. This was not an act of random brutality. It was a calculated process of dehumanization on a scale never seen before. It all began the very moment Roman legions subdued a new territory. When Rome would vanquish a rebellion in Gaul or obliterate a city in Judea, they weren't just winning a military engagement, they were processing an entire population. Imagine a factory's assembly line, but for human misery. Men of fighting age were dispatched to their deaths in the mines or the arenas. Children were sold off to slave markets across the empire, and the women were designated as captiva prizes of war, property of the state. And this is where the dark history becomes a legal reality. Under Roman law, these individuals were no longer considered legally human. They were reclassified as res crunt, bloody things, mere property, placing them in the exact same legal category as a piece of furniture or an animal. A conquered woman possessed no more rights than a common chair. You could inflict any act upon her, and it wouldn't even be a crime, because, in the eyes of the law, you cannot commit a criminal act against an inanimate object. But Rome's dehumanization wasn't just legal, it was also a public spectacle. The games were never just about entertainment. They were a form of political theater, engineered to psychologically crush both the conquered peoples and Rome's own populace. When you witnessed a captured Germanic warlord forced to battle a lion, you weren't just observing a man's death, you were watching Rome's brutal demonstration of the fate awaiting anyone who dared to defy its power. And during the midday intermission, after the elite had departed for their lunch, the proceedings would take a truly sadistic turn. Historians refer to these as the fatal charades. These were theatrical reenactments of famous myths, where condemned prisoners were compelled to act out the stories, with the crucial difference that their deaths were horrifyingly real. The poet Martial, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, documented these events with a chilling nonchalance, as if he were merely critiquing a play or a new restaurant. He recounts the tale of a prisoner costumed as Orpheus, the mythical musician whose melodies could tame any beast. This man was led into the arena, lyre in hand, before a bear was unleashed upon him. Martial, with a tone of almost cynical disappointment, records that on this occasion, the music failed as the bear savaged the man to death, while 50,000 spectators casually snacked on honey dates. In another passage, and I must warn you, this is profoundly disturbing, Martial details the fate of a woman forced to reenact the myth of Pasiphae, who coupled with a sacred bull. For this condemned prisoner, the myth was made a horrifying reality. She was subjected to a public assault by an animal before the eyes of thousands. She endured this until her injuries proved fatal. Let that sink in. The Roman state engineered a system where human beings were violated to death by animals, all for the sake of midday entertainment. This wasn't the twisted whim of a single depraved emperor. This was standard practice for decades, a chilling chapter in Rome's dark history. Senators even brought their own children to witness these spectacles. These events were advertised on walls across the city. Vendors hawked snacks to the crowds, and as Martial himself observes, whatsoever myth may sing, the arena makes it real. But the truly terrifying part is that he wrote this as a compliment. He was praising the sheer efficiency of the spectacle. This was the environment, an industrialized, bureaucratic machine of cruelty that also systematically processed conquered women into the reward system for its gladiators. So, let's turn to the men who received these rewards. Gladiators themselves existed within a bizarre paradox that the Roman world never truly reconciled. They were at once the lowest dregs and the highest celebrities of their society. Slaves who possessed less legal standing than a common dog, yet they were superstars whose faces adorned mosaics and whose names were scrawled on walls by legions of adoring fans. The women of the aristocracy, in particular, were utterly obsessed. Ancient graffiti unearthed in Pompeii dubs one gladiator the sigh of the girls, and another the glory of the ladies. We have documented accounts of noble women bribing guards and sneaking into the gladiator barracks for clandestine encounters. The gladiator named Sergius, for instance, apparently carried on affairs with several married patrician women, igniting massive scandals. But even more bizarrely, their very bodily fluids were turned into a commodity. The sweat of gladiators was scraped from their skin after a fight, mixed into olive oil, and sold as a potent aphrodisiac or a luxury beauty treatment. Just imagine that level of celebrity worship. These were enslaved men whose very perspiration was bottled and sold to the elite. Yet, for all the adoration, Rome lived in constant terror of these men. The Spartacus rebellion of 73 B.C. was a trauma seared into the Roman cultural memory, a defining moment of its dark history. A mere 78 gladiators broke free, amassed an army of 70,000 strong, and brought the Republic to the brink of collapse. For 2 full years, they outmaneuvered and crushed legion after legion. When Rome finally managed to crush the uprising, their vengeance was absolute. They crucified 6,000 survivors along the Appian Way, a body every 40 meters for 200 kilometers, creating a gruesome forest of crosses that stretched all the way from Rome to Capua. That collective trauma never faded from the Roman psyche. From that day forward, every time a gladiator lifted a sword, every trainer who ran a school, every single spectator in the stands, they all carried the memory that these very men had once come terrifyingly close to burning their world to ashes. So, the question became, how do you control men who are incredibly dangerous, incredibly valuable, and who possess both legitimate grievances and the deadly skills to act on them? The answer was a careful mix of brutal punishment and calculated rewards. These rewards included extra food rations, prize money, and even the promise of freedom after a certain number of victories. But the historical sources hint at something else, something far more primal: access to conquered women. The documentation on this subject is frustratingly sparse. Roman writers tend to mention it only in passing, as if the practice was too commonplace to warrant a detailed explanation. However, when you piece together the fragmented references from authors like Martial, Juvenal, and later sources, a disturbing pattern begins to emerge. It seems that after an especially impressive victory, particularly during the major games sponsored by the emperor or powerful senators. The gladiators who had survived and distinguished themselves were granted what the ancient texts vaguely call the privileges of the victor. Modern historians, reading between the lines and cross-referencing this with our knowledge of military rewards and the practices of slave management, have come to believe this often meant granting them access to female captives who were held in the chambers beneath the arena itself. The entire process appears to have been chillingly bureaucratic. A victorious gladiator would be led down into the hypogeum, that vast, labyrinthine network of tunnels and chambers beneath the arena floor, still clad in his armor, still covered in the blood and sand of his recent combat. An official from the gladiator school or an arena administrator would then escort him through the darkness. Their path would lead them through oil-lit tunnels, past the echoing cages of beasts and the clanking of mechanical lifts, to a very particular section of holding cells. But these were no ordinary prison cells. The archaeological record, unearthed from amphitheaters across the empire, from Capua and Pompeii to the very foundations of the Colosseum itself, reveals small, chilling chambers with very specific features: stone benches, iron rings bolted into the walls at both waist and floor level, and heavy doors designed to be locked only from the outside. In some of these rooms, there's even evidence of chains permanently fixed to the structure. The women imprisoned here were known by a specific legal term, captivi damnati *. They were condemned captives of war, already processed by the cold, efficient bureaucracy of Roman conquest. Their very names were meticulously recorded in official ledgers by officials known as the Times Commentari *, who treated them as nothing more than state property. Each woman was stripped of her identity, assigned a number, and categorized by her place of origin: *Germanica*, *Britannica*, *Parthica*. The victorious gladiator would then be presented with a row of these cells. Some historical accounts suggest he was given a choice, while others imply the women were simply assigned, much like equipment being checked out from a storehouse. This grim procedure is a stark example of Rome's dark history. The woman would be brought forth, or the gladiator would step inside, and the door would be bolted shut behind them. What transpired in those moments is not explicitly detailed in the surviving historical texts, but it requires little imagination to understand. The architecture itself tells the story that the official records omit, and here is the most sinister part of this entire affair. This was not considered a crime. To most Romans, it was not even seen as morally questionable. It was simply a part of the operational budget for the games, the cold logistics of what was known as Times Victoria Carnalis *. These logistics were managed by the very same administrators responsible for scheduling animal hunts and maintaining the arena's equipment. From the state's point of view, this system was an elegant solution to several problems. It provided a cheap way to reward loyal gladiators, as the conquered women cost the state absolutely nothing. They were, after all, already classified as spoils of war. This practice also reinforced the gladiator's sense of power and privilege, all without granting him any genuine freedom or authority. Furthermore, it sent a chilling message to both the gladiator and the conquered peoples. This is the meaning of Roman dominance. Your victory in the arena grants you a taste of the emperor's own rights, the right of absolute power over the vanquished. A Roman writer, whose name is now lost to time but whose work was quoted by later historians, stated it with brutal clarity. The victor claims his prize in the same manner the empire claims its provinces, by right of conquest. Now, let's delve into the physical spaces where this chapter of dark history unfolded, because the archaeological evidence is utterly damning. When archaeologists first began excavating beneath the Colosseum in the 19th century, their primary focus was on the marvels of Roman engineering, the elevator systems that hoisted animals to the arena floor, and the labyrinth of tunnels for moving staff and equipment. However, as the excavations pressed on, they uncovered something unexpected: specialized chambers that served no apparent logistical function. These rooms are small, typically measuring between 10 and 15 square meters. They are situated in a distinct section of the hypogeum, set apart from the animal pens and the gladiator preparation areas. It is their unique features that are so telling, and what makes modern archaeologists so uncomfortable. Stone benches line the walls, but unlike those in other chambers, these are constructed at a very particular height. Iron rings are anchored firmly into the stonework at various heights, some near the floor, others at waist level, and some even higher. The doors are made of heavy, iron-reinforced wood, and they were designed to be locked only from the outside. In several of these chambers, the walls bear silent witness to unimaginable despair, scratch marks left by desperate fingernails trying to claw through solid stone. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century AD, cryptically mentions that beneath major amphitheaters were chambers for those awaiting their use. The phrasing is deliberately ambiguous, yet in the context of his writing, he is clearly discussing the logistics of the games, a chilling euphemism that hints at this facet of Rome's dark history. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence of all comes not from historians, but from graffiti discovered in the Hypogeum beneath the amphitheater in Capua, the very city where Spartacus began his legendary rebellion. There, archaeologists found messages scratched into the cell walls. Some are in Latin, while others are in the native tongues of people from across the vast empire. While most are mere fragments, a few remain heartbreakingly legible. One message, etched in crude Latin by someone who is clearly not a native speaker, translates roughly as, "I was Aemilia of the Brigantes. I saw my children slain. Now I am nothing." Another, in what is believed to be a Celtic dialect, has been translated as a simple plea, "To any god who listens, let me die before tomorrow." These are the voices that official history rarely, if ever, preserves. Official Roman records glorify emperors and generals, meticulously detailing military triumphs and grand constructions. Yet, they deliberately omit a crucial part of their dark history, the names of the conquered women, who were simply catalogued as property. However, the very stones of their monuments bear witness. The architecture itself reveals a chilling truth: this entire system was engineered for ruthless efficiency and systematic repetition. These were not makeshift sites for random acts of violence. They were purpose-built, meticulously maintained facilities with very specific design features. Every feature was intended to streamline the horrific events that took place within. When you compare this to Rome's management of other gladiatorial logistics, a disturbing pattern emerges. From the gladiator barracks and animal pens to the weapon armories, every single component of the arena's infrastructure was methodically planned and standardized throughout the empire. The chambers for the times, captivity times, followed this exact same blueprint. This was nothing less than state-sanctioned infrastructure for systematic violation. Some scholars, grappling with this piece of dark history, suggest we shouldn't overinterpret the purpose of these rooms, arguing they might have served multiple functions and that we risk projecting modern sensibilities onto ambiguous evidence. But when you align the architectural facts with the surviving literary clues, the established patterns of Roman military culture, and simple logic about how the system functioned, the picture becomes agonizingly clear. We must now face the most harrowing aspect of this dark history, what it truly meant for the women ensnared within this brutal system. Official accounts are almost entirely silent about their personal experiences. There are no diaries, no first-hand testimonies. All that remains are cold ledgers that list them as mere numbers and property inventories that describe them as if they were livestock. Entries read, female, Germanic, approximately 20 years old, in good health, assigned to Colosseum holding. From these fragments, however, we can begin to reconstruct the nightmare, based on what we understand of the Roman process of conquest. These women were not random captives. They were taken from specific contexts of absolute trauma. When Rome subjugated a region that dared to resist, such as during the Dacian Wars or the brutal suppression of the Britannic Revolt led by Boudicca, the aftermath was chillingly methodical. Roman military doctrine dictated that once the final battle was won, the civilian population was to be systematically processed. Men of fighting age were typically executed or enslaved for hard labor. Children below a certain age were torn from their families and sold to slave markets in the East, destined never to see their homes or loved ones again. Women of childbearing age, however, were designated as times captiva times and transported in chains to these holding facilities. For any woman caught in this fate, the journey to the arena was a descent through successive layers of hell. You would have witnessed your village being put to the torch. You would have seen your own children ripped screaming from your arms, before being chained to dozens of other women and force-marched hundreds of miles toward Rome. There, you would be stripped, inspected like an animal, branded with a number, and thrown into a cell beneath the grandest monument of the very civilization that had annihilated your entire world. The waiting itself was a unique form of torture. You could hear everything: the thunderous roar of the crowd above, as people you may have known were executed in imaginative ways for sport, the terrified cries of animals being butchered, and the wild cheers when a gladiator landed an especially artful killing blow. And you would know, with absolute certainty, that you were never leaving. There was no system of ransom, no possibility of a prisoner exchange. Rome did not negotiate with those it conquered. Your people back home, assuming any of them even survived, would never learn of your fate. You would simply vanish into the grinding machinery of the empire. Then would come the sound of footsteps, the shriek of a cell door opening, a selection being made, and the heavy clang of the door locking again. But with you now on the other side of it, alone with a man who had just spent his afternoon taking lives for public amusement. Roman law offered you absolutely no protection. You could not appeal to a magistrate because, in the eyes of the law, you did not exist as a person. You could not even choose the final escape of taking your own life. An act Roman culture sometimes viewed with a degree of respect, because if you were to somehow succeed, you'd only be depriving the state of its property. Your body would still be put to use, just for a different purpose. This was psychological warfare waged on a civilizational scale. The degradation of conquered women was not some unfortunate side effect of Roman military policy. It was a core, deliberate strategy. The objective was to shatter the spirit of resistance so completely that future generations would not even dare to contemplate defiance against Rome. Ancient sources are shockingly explicit about this. After crushing the Great Jewish Revolt in 70 AD, the historian Josephus documented that the Romans' Jewish women were deliberately taken, destined for the legions and the games, in a calculated display for the survivors. It was a brutal demonstration that they had lost not only their sovereignty but also the very ability to protect their own families. The message was chillingly clear: defy Rome, and this would be the fate of your daughters. Yet, for all its industrialized cruelty, this system occasionally fractured in the most unexpected ways. Rome was obsessed with upholding certain illusions about its own nature. The empire projected an image of itself as the bearer of civilization and order to a savage world. This self-perception demanded that certain atrocities remain concealed, which leads us to an event that dragged the system into the uncomfortable light: the gladiatrixes. On exceedingly rare occasions, women would fight within the arena itself. Ancient accounts are divided on the identities of these women. Some were undoubtedly slaves, compelled to fight for their lives, yet others seem to have been noblewomen who, in a culture affording them almost no autonomy, viewed the arena as a twisted path to power and fame. The mere existence of female gladiators scandalized Rome's elite. The satirist Juvenal wrote with scathing contempt about aristocratic women training with these weapons, asking, "What sense of decency can be found in a woman who dons a helmet?" In the year 200 AD, Emperor Septimius Severus attended games in Antioch that showcased female combatants. According to the historian Cassius Dio, who was in attendance, something unforeseen occurred. The Greek audience responded with shock and unease, treating the combat with the same gravity they afforded male gladiators. But the Roman spectators jeered, shouted lewd remarks, and reduced the entire spectacle to an obscene farce. These female fighters weren't perceived as warriors. They were viewed as a titillating display, mistakenly placed in an arena intended for mortal combat. Severus was reportedly horrified, not by the violence itself, but by the crude and vulgar reaction of his fellow Romans. The dignity of the games, his powerful propaganda tool, was being eroded by the audience's failure to distinguish violence from carnality when women were the combatants. Consequently, he banned women from fighting in the arena altogether. Consider what this reveals. The issue was never about protecting women from harm. Female captives were still being held in the cells right beneath the arena floor. The problem was that the violence had become too conspicuous, too public, in a way that threatened Rome's carefully crafted self-image. The emperor had no issue with the abuse. He just demanded it return to the shadows, a hidden part of Rome's dark history. The exploitation didn't cease after Severus's decree. It simply retreated back into the gloom of the Hypogeum, where it had always thrived. And here is the most disturbing truth. This system didn't end because of some moral enlightenment. The games themselves persisted for centuries, even after Rome officially embraced Christianity in the 4th century AD. The gladiatorial contest continued for decades, with the final recorded combat taking place in 404 AD, when a monk by the name of Telemachus leaped into the arena to halt a fight, only to be torn to pieces by the enraged mob. Only then did Emperor Honorius issue a permanent ban on gladiatorial combat. But even this did not dismantle the system of captivity below. The infrastructure remained intact. The practice of taking war captives continued as standard military procedure throughout the Byzantine era. This grim system eventually faded away, not due to any moral progress, but because the Roman Empire itself crumbled. The great machinery of conquest ground to a halt, and the supply of captives simply dried up. The institution perished from a lack of resources, not from any ethical evolution. It's a sobering piece of our dark history. Today, when tourists visit the Colosseum, they snap selfies before its magnificent arches and marvel at the feats of ancient engineering. Tour guides speak of gladiatorial combat and wild animal hunts, yet most never mention what transpired in the chambers below. But the stones are still there. Those iron rings bolted into the walls have not rusted away. The frantic scratches left by desperate fingernails remain preserved beneath centuries of dust. The ledgers that catalogued human beings as mere inventory are stored away in Vatican archives and museums across Europe, available for anyone willing to look. We are not speaking of a few isolated incidents. This was policy. This was infrastructure. This was a normal part of their dark history. The Colosseum stands as a monument to the true meaning of empire, not just the grand architecture and celebrated military victories, but the industrialized horror required to sustain absolute power. Every single stone in that arena was purchased not with currency, but with a currency of lives, systematically and deliberately extinguished. This was done through some of the most calculated methods of cruelty ever engineered. The grand spectacle on the sand was only the part of the story Rome permitted you to see. The other, more terrifying part, transpired in the chambers beneath the arena floor, in the deafening silence after the crowd's roar had faded. The echoes of those voices, the ones meant to be forgotten, still remain. These are the accounts Roman chroniclers deemed insignificant, yet they are etched into those walls if you are brave enough to listen. This is the chapter of dark history they omit from the classroom. If this has revealed a truth you've never encountered, be sure to hit that subscribe button and enable notifications, because we will continue to unearth the dark history they fought to keep buried. Share your reactions in the comments, and I will see you in our next expedition into the most shadowed recesses of the past.